All right. Hey, class. My apologies for not being able to be there today in class. There are a few reasons why I'm kind of busy this weekend, so I'm not going to be in town. And so instead, what I decided I'd do is I'd record a very quick lecture. This is hopefully only going to run around half an hour or so. A very quick lecture on the reading that we did for today, and I also want to touch upon your second paper for the class. I will take more questions on that second paper in class, so don't feel like this is by any means an exhaustive description of the second paper for the class. But I do want to spend a little bit of time talking about that second paper. You do have the prompt available to you on Icon, so at some point in the very near future, please go and take a look at that prompt on Icon. That'll give you the schedule of events. We are going to do a rough draft workshop, okay, and we're going to do that next Friday. And additionally, we're going to have a final draft due not the Monday after Thanksgiving break, but the Friday after. So I'm going to space out a little bit more time. I'm not going to assign the deadline for December 2nd. I'm going to push it back towards the end of that week. So when you get back from Thanksgiving break, you'll have that entire week to meet with me, talk with me, and get feedback on your paper. So I do want for you all to take a look at that prompt now rather than later, because we do have a rough draft workshop coming up in a week. I've asked for 2 pages on the prompt. I'm really looking for a very preliminary rough draft. I want an introduction with a thesis statement. I want a film selected, but it doesn't have to be anywhere near a complete draft. Just enough for you to be able to workshop it in class and get feedback on your ideas. Okay. That paper essentially is going to be a structuralism / post-structuralism essay. Okay, so just like we did for the first paper, realism / expressionism as an analysis prompt. Okay, so I had you choose either a realistic or an expressionistic perspective, and you adopted a thesis in coincidence with that perspective, and you used a film to argue that perspective. You're going to do the same thing in this paper, but you're either going to take a structuralist or a post-structuralist position. Okay, we have read a number of texts that identify pretty explicitly as either structuralist or post-structuralist texts. Okay, but we have also talked about the differences and tendencies between these two approaches. Okay, and so even texts and even weeks that don't explicitly identify as structuralist or post-structuralist have structuralist or post-structuralist tendencies. And so you are very open in terms of the different types of thesis statements that you could produce in this particular assignment. I gave you a number of examples for the divisions between structuralism and post-structuralism on that prompt, so please take a look at that. But a few general ones that we've talked about. We've talked about adherence to delineating a structure, okay, delineating a codified structure versus testing out the limits of a structure and finding out when structural rules break down. We've talked about structuralism being a ahistorical approach, ahistorical, so ahistorical, meaning outside, thinking of structure outside of history, which is Saussurean semiotics, if you remember. That's not concerned with the discursive element in language. Language is individual speech act, but rather the rules of language that don't change over time, that don't change over time and don't change from one cultural context to another. So structuralism as ahistorical versus post-structuralism as historical or historically grounded, a historically grounded understanding of structure. We've talked about the singularity of the spectator versus multiplicity of spectators. Another way of understanding that, as I wrote on the prompt, is homogeneous spectator of structuralism, spectator in the singular, the spectator of Barthes and of the other realists, and of the bulk of classical film theory, versus the spectator in the plural, which is conceived first from, if you remember on our readings, first from Laura Mulvey, but also even in this week when we talked about different types of resistance cinemas and resistant spectators. Okay, we received more information on what it means to be a black spectator presented with an image that is an image and a point of identification that is other to or ulterior to your own self, and the choices that you make as a spectator when you're presented with that as a text. And so you can think about it in terms of spectatorship. You can think about it in terms of the power of the spectator. Power is kind of a weird way of phrasing it, but what I mean by that is the agency of the spectator. Okay, so a passive versus an active spectator. A spectator that receives information from a text versus a spectator that activates a text. You remember one of our post-structural texts was The Death of the Author, in which we talked about the main catalyst for meaning being transferred from the text and from the author as producer of meaning to the reader as the one that writes onto the text by reading. Okay, and in cinematic terms, that would be the viewer that writes onto or films onto the film by viewing. And so those are just a few of the divisions that you can think about. And what you want to do is you want to formulate a thesis statement that either takes a structural or a post-structural approach to a particular concern within film studies. So basically, you could just about create any thesis statement you want to. There's very little that is off limits on this paper. I just want for you to think of it either in structuralist or post-structuralist terms. Okay, so understand your thesis as being one or the other. The words structuralism, post-structuralism, they don't have to appear in your paper to the same extent that they did for the first paper, because I'm not formulating this as an either-or proposition. I'm not asking you to argue for a structuralist or a post-structuralist approach. I'm asking for you instead to give me a structuralist or a post-structuralist thesis statement. So to give you a couple of examples, you could do sort of like a Raymond Ballard close reading of a film in order to make some sort of structural argument. So if you remember, Raymond Ballard did his close reading of The Big Sleep, and he used that very close reading to make an argument about how the film achieves balance through repetition and difference. You could do that sort of a reading, okay? Or you could talk about, for your film example, you could talk about a film that tests the limits of a particular structure. So maybe a film that breaks with balance through repetition and difference. And you could use that as a rebuttal of someone like Raymond Ballard, okay? Those are just two examples of theses that you could do. We're gonna read next week in our genre week. We're gonna read one what I would call structuralist approach to genre, a semantic syntactic approach to film genre, and one what I would call post-structuralist approach. Okay, and it's post-structuralist, and this is Linda Williams' essay on film bodies. It's post-structuralist because it's concerned with in horror and melodrama and in pornography how the bodies of spectators come to, through an act of mimicry, imitate that of what they see on the screen. So to give you an example, when you see a horror film and somebody screams, they go, ah, you scream as well. Okay, and so you're going to see an example of a subject, in this instance, the subject of genre in American cinema, being approached from a structuralist and a post-structuralist perspective. So you're going to get some input on how you could do that with any subject. And I've also, in that prompt, given you an example of a number of different subjects that you could choose if you were looking for something to talk about as a subject. So think on it. If you have any questions on anything related to those papers, please feel free to ask. I will be available all next week to talk about paper ideas. So my suggestion is, if you have a paper idea before next Friday, please come visit with me and talk to me about it, and I will do my best to assist you and make sure that you're all set for the draft. And I will also be available the week when we get back, so I can look at drafts, I can give feedback on them in lieu of the deadline, which will be the Friday after we get back from Thanksgiving break. So that's all I wanted to say about the papers. Okay. I want to spend another 20 minutes or so talking specifically about the reading that I put up for today, which is about third world film and theory. Okay, and I've given to you on Icon a number of key terms that are useful for you and that I want for you to refer to at the end of this. Okay, I'm going to make a few short points regarding those key terms. I'm going to make sure we're clear on the different concepts associated with third world film. I'm going to make clear a few definitions that I think are important for context, both for the essay for today, but also for the essay that we read for Wednesday. So I'm going to try and clarify that. I'm going to use my book to take us through it very quickly. And the first thing that I want to define is third world itself. Okay, and there's a definition of third world that is given here on page 93 that I think is useful, and it's going to be on your key concepts in 2 sentences. I separated them because they both contribute, I think, something original to our understanding of what the third world means. And the third world refers, I'm reading on the top of 93, to the colonized, neo-colonized, or decolonized nations and minorities of the world whose economic and political structures have been shaped and deformed within the colonial process. Okay, so first standard definition of the third world. Third world refers to those nations that have a colonial, neo-colonial, post-colonial relationship to the rest of the world. Okay, typically this is a relationship, when I say the rest of the world, it's to the first world. Okay. And then the second sentence here, the term itself challenged and the colonizing vocabulary which posited these nations as backward and underdeveloped, mired in a presumably static tradition. Okay, and so the argument that Stam is making here is that the third world as a concept challenges the notion or the preconception that the third world is inherently and fundamentally backwards. This is an argument that is being drawn from a sociologist, by the name of Edward Said, and he wrote a number of books on the subject, but one in particular on Orientalism, which is extremely important. And Orientalism in that text is defined as being the pejorative association of what we'd call underdeveloped countries with primitivism. Okay, and so the idea there is that third world countries are inherently or fundamentally primitive and backwards in their ways. That the entire world aspires towards progress, cultural progress, technological progress, industrial progress, and they represent a earlier point in that progression, in that trajectory, okay? And so these nations are backwards or primitive nations, all right? The argument in Orientalism is that this pejorative labeling of other countries as primitive or backwards, even though they are less technologically developed and industrially developed, it makes it seem as if third world culture and third world society is more primitive than first world culture, okay? And so take religion as an example, okay? I don't know, much I want to say here, but third world religion oftentimes looked at as being